Hello, everybody. My name is Arnie Greenland, and I'm the organizer of this webinar. We are very honored today to have a colleague of mine, Margret Bjarnadottir from University of Maryland Business School, as our main invited guest for the day. And looking forward to her discussion. But before I introduce her, I want to quickly take a moment and talk about the practice section and their activities. As you know, practice section has a very important role within Informs. The Franz Edelman Award, Daniel H. Wagner Prize, the George D. Smith competition, all those are activities that are run by the practice section. We also have 2 webinar series. It turns out because October is such a busy month with the annual meeting that we don't have one scheduled for October. And this, we alternate between the Applied Analytics Success Stories and this series, Sustaining Outstanding Analytics Organizations. And there will be one in November, which will be finalized soon. This month, and really every month, we have a networking happy hour, and this one's on September 30th. We do many other things, so please check us out and participate in all of our events. And I'm going to stop sharing, and without any further ado, take a moment to introduce my friend and colleague, Margret Bjarnadottir. She's an associate professor at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business. She's been on the faculty there for 11 years and is now associate professor of management science and statistics, and has very recently, in the last few years, started a new company, and you're going to hear all about it today. And without any further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Margret, and who feel free to add some more important information about yourself.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for having me. So when you asked me to kind of kick us off the introduction of PayAnalytics, I started just collecting my slides from all of my academic talks on pay equity. And then I figured for this crowd, maybe it would be more interesting to see actually the business pitch for the company. So and also those slides look a lot better than the academic slides. So I figured I would kind of give you the business pitch, like why are we doing this? How do we do it? Why is it important? And then maybe we can have a conversation around that. So that's what I plan to do. But maybe even before I dive into, who we are and what we do, I figured, because this is an Informs talk, and, having started my own company, that now there are 20 people working for this company, which is in my mind is crazy. I thought it was interesting for everybody just to hear how this got started, because I think, especially if you're coming out of, academia, or you have, just finished, if you're in school and you're finishing your studies, how does one and why does one start a company? And I think when we think about our field and what we excel at decision making. Right? That's what our whole field centers around, is to support decision making. And really, that's how this started. So I was approached by a COO that was responsible for pay equity within his organization. And they had measured an 8% equal pay gap. So, and then when I say an equal pay gap, that's after we account for all the things that should drive pay differences. So we accounted for responsibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was 8%. And that was announced to the organization, and obviously it was unacceptable. So, the CEO was on the stage talking to the employees that they were going to address this. Everybody was going to be super aware of it in all of their decision making, whether, hiring, promotion, salary adjustments. But then they measured the pay gap again 12 months later, and it was still 8%. So then that was a little bit of an aha moment for the management, in that you don't address demographic pay gaps with good intentions alone. So you need quantitative decision support. So then the COO started asking around, so, facing an 8% pay gap, who should get a raise, How large should those raises be? How do we actually close this gap? And at the point, that point in time, there was no one that could actually answer the question. So then to me, this sounded like a fabulous OR problem, right? Because we have a decision problem, right? So we need to determine who should get a raise and how large they should be. We have an objective, or at least a task. We need to close the pay gap, and then we can think about what is the best way to achieve that. So this all started as a research problem, just understanding, can we build the right optimization problems to actually address this decision problem? So that's how all of this actually started. It just started as a research project, and a lot of this work is done with a colleague of mine that is at Villanova University, David Anderson. He was my PhD student at the University of Maryland. And I remember, like, early on, we had a conversation and we were talking about, yeah, it would be great to get some consulting hours out of this. And then, a few years later, we have built this entire company focused on this. So it has been quite a little bit more than just a few consulting hours that came out of this research. So let me maybe then share my screen and maybe walk you through kind of what we do and how we do it and why we do it, etc. So what we have, what I often say, so when I'm talking to investors or giving these seminars around pay equity, I often say that PayAnalytics was born out of the lack of basically quantitative decision support tools for HR and compensation managers. And when we think about the organization and how analytics have really revolutionized the analytic, the entire organization, HR was kind of left out of that for the longest time. So for the longest time, when you looked over the organization and how, OR is changing how we manage our supply chain and our finance, our entire operations, really the HR was there in the corner with maybe Excel spreadsheets, maybe some standardized reports, but really no decision tools. So that's kind of where we come in, and you can see, broader in the field of HR analytics that really, that's the field that is taking off really. So now about this was probably 5, 6, 7, I stopped counting the years, but now 5, 6, 7 years later, we have now grown to serving over 100 customers, cross industries, across governmental agencies, with users in over 40 countries, all continents except Antarctica. So that just gives you a sense for kind of how we have grown. So what did we build to achieve this? So we built a cloud solution. And now this is going to sound quite cheesy because now I'm talking to an OR audience, but what I always say to when I'm pitching this organization is that we have built the solution on the foundation of science and fairness principles, really with the aim of eliminating demographic pay gaps. So we built a decision support platform that not only measures your pay gaps, but identifies which employees should get raises, how large those raises should be in order to, to close the pay gaps, and all while taking into account the operational constraints of the company and the compensation strategy of the organization. So that's what we have built. And then, what does this platform do? So really, it's equipping organizations with the tools that they need to correct and close pay gaps, and maybe more importantly, making a lasting change. So we see results. So for example, our initial development partner drove down their gender pay gap to 0% in a matter of months after having been unable to do so for years. So I love this organization. So this organization is a relatively small utility company. And early on in like 2011, they determined that they were going to eliminate the gender pay gap. However, they managed to kind of get it down, but they were unable to kind of close it entirely until our collaboration. Another example of how the progress and the results that we are seeing with our our partners is that an organization with over 100,000 employees brought down their pay equity gaps below 1% across 50 subsidiaries in just over 9 months. So they just received, like 3 days ago, so this is a large German company, and since this is now out in the open, this is actually Allianz, and they just received an HR Tech Award for eliminating their gender pay gap with our tech. Some very prestigious German award that they got just on Monday. So we are seeing actually real change happen, which is amazing. So what we then try to do, more than just measure and tell them what to do, we also make it easy for organization to budget for the necessary steps. So for example, if you measure at 6%, how much is it going to cost you to get to 4 and 2 and 0? And it's worth noting that kind of with our algorithmic approach, we typically save companies 20 to 30% compared to handing out equal percent raises to all affected employees. So how did we then do this? So now I will maybe add a little bit more than what I usually say. So usually when I talk about PayAnalytics, I talk about that the methodology behind measuring the pay gap is generally agreed upon. And in this crowd, I can tell you it's basically a log linear regression where we take wages and we regress, or basically the log of wages, and we regress them on all the factors that should explain pay. So think about skills, responsibility, work environment, etc. Even performance, if your pay policy is performance driven. And then we include the demographics. So if after accounting for all the different characteristics of the employees, we still see differences that can be explained by demographics, well, these are your demographic pay gaps. So then from there, we really focused on understanding. So given that this is our measurement tool, and this has been both mandated, we see this in Corto law, we see this in the European Transparency Directive. So the measurement piece is kind of set. So then we spent a lot of our R&D really teasing these things apart, understanding really the impact of each employee on the gender pay gap or on any demographic pay gap. And this was what was really interesting. So if we think back to what I said about the measurement piece, that is actually a log linear regression. So if you think about a log linear regression, well, your brain should maybe go to, oh, there's something non-linear going on. And that's what makes the decision problem really interesting, is that each employee's impact on the pay gap is not straightforward. And the results can actually sometimes be quite counterintuitive. So for example, if we look at an organization, you can find women within that organization that are such in their characteristics, meaning their skills, responsibilities, work environment, etc., that if you give them a raise, you might actually increase the measured pay gap. And conversely, you can actually find men within that organization that are such in terms of their characteristics that if you give them a raise, you would decrease the measurement of the gender pay gap. So based on that and other observations, and really we spent a lot of time kind of tearing the linear algebra behind the regression apart to understand these insights. And what we found also was that there's almost no correlation between the perceived fairness of somebody getting a raise and actually the impact of that raise on the gender pay gap. And why is that important? So that's super important because if an organization is only focused on the cost of closing the pay gap, then the resulting pay structure and compensation strategy would really suffer. So if you take just a cost minimization lens to this problem, you will be messing up the pay structure of organizations. So it became very clear to us that the solution would need to be not only data informed, but also rooted in fairness principles, really. So so that's kind of what we spent a lot of R&D, and then the way we have involved is that we started thinking almost entirely just about the gender pay gap, but the way that pay equity is evolving is that it's not just about one pay gap. We have multiple gaps across gender, race, ethnicity, age, and any other dimension, veteran status, disability, etc. So we need simultaneously to ensure pay equity across the organization and within each subgroup of employees. So when we start thinking about actually operationalizing the optimization model behind all of this, it's not just as simple as plug and play, simple optimization. We have to be really careful about the multiple dimensions of the employee organization. So all of that just to say that we built a platform that will consider multiple pay gaps across the organization. We incorporate the structure of the organization, and we emphasize that all the adjustments that we make are both fair and efficient. So that's kind of a little bit about how we built the algorithms and the complexities of that. So then maybe one thing I can mention is that other benefits of bringing kind of data-centered lens to pay equity is that we all have built-in biases, and the problem of demographic pay gaps are more complex than just simply someone trying to keep down the wage bill. So, for example, this is one of my favorite examples, and this is actually from the same early adopter of our technology. So this was an organization that had been trying to close their pay gaps for a number of years unsuccessfully. And this is an organization that's very, like, at the forefront of equitable workplaces. So what we found when we ran the analysis on their data was that the bias was actually not equally spread across the organization. What we found was that the bias was for their high-performing female employees. So yes, the high-performing, female employees were being paid above average, but they weren't being paid to the top like the high-performing men. So for that HR manager, it was really an aha moment to understand her blind spots, and then we corrected that, and that was a big part of actually managing to close the pay gap for that organization. And we see this repeatedly over and over again. So, performance data is one of my favorite data in this context, because everybody or a lot of organizations say they're performance driven and they measure performance, but then you actually measure the relationship between pay and performance, and sometimes it's as bad as being reverse. So the better the performance, the lower the wage. So you have this opportunity to basically test these preconceived notions of drivers of pay, and especially kind of in a holistic manner, and often the data simply proves these assumptions wrong. All right, so what do? We measure the pay gap, we plan how do we close the pay gap, who should get a raise, how much is it going to cost, and then as a last piece, we need to integrate pay equity into the decision processes. So this is another kind of big piece of how the pay equity landscape has really been changing over the last 5 years. So when I entered this field, pay equity was really almost like an auditing exercise. So once a year, or maybe every 2 years, an organization would get an external advisor who would look at their pay equity and make some recommendations, and then they would continue as business as usual. But if that's how organizations behave, then all what will happen is that the gaps will start opening up. So if you actually want to maintain pay equity within an organization, you need to start thinking about how do you integrate pay equity into your decision processes. So just think about an organization with 100,000 employees, maybe a 10% turnover. You are making, or you need to recruit then 10,000 people a year. that's 10,000 decisions about starting salary. So you can just think about, if you haven't integrated the notion of pay equity and fair pay into those decision processes, you can start opening up the gaps again. And then you're continuously kind of chasing your tail. So really, when we think about whether it's my platform or the competition, you can really see that everything is evolving through integration of pay equity into all of these different aspects. So whether it's hiring, promotions, etc. So this is how we're doing. So we have been growing almost exponentially since we launched. And now I'm going to tell you the reason why we're doing well, in my own biased opinion. So because obviously my opinion of my own company are biased. So one is that we managed to take what we do well as an organization or as a practitioners of OR and built it into a user-friendly solution that manages to translate all the scientific approaches and details into something that's easy to use. Second, I would argue that our platform has the most robust analytical engine. I think we are best in class. Again, my biased opinion. And then a third thing that we have done is that we developed really a universal approach to pay equity, but we make sure to be locally relevant. So into this platform, we have built reporting at the local level. So whether that's really the ever-changing reporting requirements in California, or lönekartläggning in Sweden, the enumeration register in Spain, the unique approach they're taking to pay equity in Canada, all of that is built in on top of that universal approach. So that's some of the reasons, but maybe the fourth reason is the really fast changing legal environment. So it's increasingly important to be on top of this, as the legislative environment is really fast changing. The most recent EU transparency draft requires companies to drive any pay equity gap below 2.5%. Canada is enforcing equal pay for work of equal value. And just this year, we see a number of US states that have been updating their legal code. So that's also another reason why we are doing well and we keep on growing and all of those things. So so then what do I think and where are we going? So maybe I can close with a couple of thoughts. I think beyond these legislative requirements, even beyond what is called EGS reporting, environment, government, social reporting for organization, it's simply no longer acceptable to pay women or minority lower wages because of our gender or the color of their skin. And we see this increasingly reflected in companies really publicly announcing their steps that they are taking to eliminate demographic pay gaps. And in my mind, if you think about organization in today's labor markets, organizations that want to be competitive, they need to take pay equity seriously and be able to communicate to their employees that they are proactively addressing pay equity. But then I would also maybe add that beyond pay equity, PayAnalytics is really about quality compensation. So thinking back to that same original development partner, they were quoted as stating that having something like PayAnalytics really allowed them to stop looking at the rear view mirror. So thinking back to when I was describing that HR was sitting in a corner with nothing but Excel files and maybe some standardized reports. So now having access to something like this platform finally allowed them to stop looking in the rear view mirrors at out-of-date measures of their pay gap and really instead understanding every salary decision, its impact on the pay gaps and on the overall pay structure. So, so pay equity shouldn't be hard. And I think using optimization and statistics, we have made it at least a little bit easier for organizations. So I will stop here. And Arnie, I'm sure you have
Okay,
some
so
questions.
first of all, what an amazing story. I'm very taken. So thank you so much for sharing that. I did want to say, in my introduction, I forgot to mention a couple of things about Margret. Well, first of them is she has a great pedigree. She got her PhD at MIT in what we all know to be a very strong OR department. And the other thing I want to say is, when I first met Margret, it's when I started in 2014 as professor of practice at the Smith School. I learned quickly you were both an outstanding teacher and a very strong researcher. You were also incredibly generous in helping me, someone who spent my entire career in practice, to transition into the academic environment. You shared a lot of materials, which I used at the very last day, and helped me think about the classes that I was about to teach, especially in particular data mining, but also all of my classes. So I want to start out with my first question. Oh, and I did want to also add, this was not on my original plan, but this is an incredible example of doing good with good OR. Should be part of our our story. It informs very much, because it's this is just a great example of having a social conscience and turning that into something that's important for all of us. And of course, there are many areas, but equity in across the board in many areas certainly pay. But having that mindset and creating such an incredible successful tool, that I just very impressed. So my first question is, can you describe to our audience the path that led you from a strong, successful academic career to want to create your own startup analytics company?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke a little bit about it, when I was talking about that CEO. So really, this started as a research project, and then I started talking about what we were doing. So that COO was the CEO of one of the financial institutions in my home country, Iceland. And then I started talking about this with a couple of my friends, and one of those friends of mine were actually in the C-suite at this utility company, and she said, "Oh, this is something we need." And that's really when things kicked off. So it was really through almost like networking, how this came to be and really grow and start to become something. So they actually did pay us a little bit for our calculations that we then presented in Excel. And she was also, so I mean, there's a lot of there was a lot of good collaboration that happened there. But I think one of the biggest turning points was when we were working with that. She was the chief HR manager, also responsible for comp. And, coming out of academia and having to adapt to the real world. So what we did, it was a decision problem. So we formulated, in our ivory towers, and our objective was to minimize the cost. So minimize the cost subject to closing this pay gap, right? Easy, beautiful. We could prove a lot of different things about this formulation. And then she said in one meeting, there's no way I'm giving somebody a raise just because you tell me it's cheap. And that was okay, aha. So this is not the cost minimization problem. So then we took a U-turn, right? And rewrote all of our algorithms and our approach. But I think that collaboration, because I think your question was about how do you transition or make this happen or cross over from academia into practice. The key is to identify a good partner as soon as you can. So one thing is to have the idea, but you have to get validation for what you're doing as soon as you can. So we had that initial partner, and then we felt we had something. So we entered the business competition. So there was like a, entrepreneurial competition. And we actually won that. So then there was a little bit of pressure to actually do something with this. And then it, grew up from there. So there was a little bit of prize money in that competition. That was enough to hire a Microsoft software engineer that could basically create an Excel add-in. So our beta, so you can think about the beta version of the software, was actually written in Visual Basics in Excel. And if anyone has written anything for Excel, it's fragile as anything will be. So, not something I would recommend, but it was enough to get people interested. And then people started calling me about this Excel add-in. And that's kind of where we knew we might have something. Because people were actually willing to pay for an Excel add-in that we drove around town on a UPS stick and would put it on their computers from a UPS stick. This is crazy to think about it after the fact, but that's how we started. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. And before I continue with questions, there's at the bottom of your screen, if you put your cursor on the screen, you'll see a Q&A section, which is where in the last 20 minutes of this webinar, we'll have questions from the audience. So please enter questions as you think of them, as you've heard what Margret has to share. And that's the place that I will look for those. Anyway, so this is a follow-up because you answered the question I had in mind for the next place already, but you mentioned some things when you were just talking. For example, your focus on integration, how important that was to get it integrated with the business. You mentioned, or you certainly had to think about how do you communicate to senior managers, like the little example you gave about how I'm not going to give anybody a raise based on just one factor. It's really complex and multidimensional. But you have to get senior management, and every practitioner understands that it's not all about the map. It's about how do you communicate this in a way that management, senior managers in particular, get sort of engaged, get involved, feel that this is really going to be important for their business. So could you talk a little bit about, in a sense, your transition from the academic world to the business world, and whether you had any specific strategies that you used to do those things that I said? For example, how do you get senior managers to change the way they think?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. So I think in a sense, I'm a little bit lucky because the regulatory and legal environment are doing that talking for me, right? So a lot of the conversations that I'm having over in Europe these days is focused on the new EU Transparency Act. Everybody knows it's coming. Everybody needs to take action. So selling the importance of pay equity up to the board was almost done for me. And then it's a matter of, okay, so if the buy-in is already at the top, just out of whether it's they want to do it for, to do good, or whether they're just being forced to do it, then I think, how do we then make it easy for the comp and the HR managers to analyze and understand and communicate to that layer? And I think we're still working on it, to be honest. So, because coming from academia, we are very used to being very thorough. So think about the last 5% of our academic papers that take 3 years because we're doing all the robustness checks and all of these checks. And when we started designing the platform, it was a little bit, of an engineering flavor. But I also think that's the strength of the platform. If you are interested, you can dig into and get all the technical results that you can, but we are still working on how do we, better communicate. What is the model telling us? Why is it telling us that? Why are we making that recommendation? And I think that's always an ongoing battle. And we have some, really cool designs on the table now that we'll be implementing. But yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet, and we have to be mindful about it. But yeah, we're working on it, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Great answer. Okay, so here's another direction. Practitioners certainly understand that success in the business environment certainly takes a great product, and I'm definitely sure you got one. And of course, it's based on advanced analytics, what we do in Informs. However, it also takes the right team.
Yeah.
How have you endeavored to create your team? In particular, what is the mix of analytics expertise and other skills such as IT, marketing, and general business management? And how did you recruit and or train your team? I know that's a big question, but
there's a lot of questions in that question. No, so I think, you go through different stages. So, they started out as David and I, coming up and writing some algorithms and testing them, etc. So we had kind of 2 PhDs in OR. So we had that covered. So then it's the question, okay, how do you then build an organization? And then it's about convincing those that you know are better than you at other stuff to join you. So one of the most critical points in time was when I convinced the best coder that I know to join us. Somebody that could take our beta that was in Excel and actually create a cloud solution. So I think that was huge when he decided to do that on weekends and evenings. And that he later became our CTO. So as soon as we actually got a little bit of funding, he was actually the first person that was on payroll. So it was convincing, him to join us. And then another kind of critical person to come on board was when we, thinking about, what I might have done differently, was when we finally brought on a CBO, so a Chief Business Development Officer. So that was huge. So actually someone whose job is to actually sell what we are building. So, yeah, definitely we could probably have started to think about that earlier in the process. But, and then again, hiring someone that is way better than you at talking to people, at emailing people, at cold calling people, right? So even though I'm on this webinar, I'm an introvert. So if I'm not teaching and not on a webinar, I'm perfectly fine on my own, not talking to people. So we hired, her name is Guðrún, and she is amazing, and she is a way bigger extrovert than I am. So she can carry on, meet people and carry on conversations about the importance of pay equity, etc. So so it's about finding people that you trust and that are excellent, because that's the 1, 2, and 3. If you get the right people in place that are better than you, that you trust, then you can run with it. And I think, especially with a startup, it's very uncertain in the beginning. We might all just be working on this, and then it might not go anywhere. And most startups don't go anywhere, right? So we are one of the lucky ones that, we're still running. So yeah, tangent. Like the saying is always, having a startup is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's not a marathon. It's like this backyard ultra where they run for 200 kilometers. And then if you're lucky. So, so I think with regards to the team, so the first, like in the early stages, is about finding people that are way better than you, that can do a better job. And there needs to also be a little bit of a level of trust. And then once, things start rolling, I think for any startup is an ongoing challenge to hire the right people. And it's still a challenge. So we've been very fortunate. We have an excellent dev team in place. So we are starting to, roll out additions really fast. And then right now we are scaling up our sales and marketing. And finding good people there is also a challenge. So hiring people, especially, so the academia prepares you for certain things. Like if you think about, a career in academia, what are we really good at? We are good at writing grants. and we are really good at answering negative feedback. So if anyone who has ever submitted a paper knows that if it's anything that you've been trained for is, getting the negative feedback constantly. So, going out and trying to get, venture funding, or clients are getting no. I mean, it didn't touch us because we've been training for that our whole lives. But other things like hiring people, we are not very good at. So, I'm not involved in that at all. And another thing, and again, a tangent, but one of the things, again, kind of relating to being in academia, in academia, I mean, we are trained to test our algorithms to the T and compare to every other method out there and report on the incremental gain of that one algorithm, and etc., and prove, this and that. And then, that's how our brain is wired. So then here's, the startup that you are supporting. And one thing that really struck me is that, I mean, I firmly believe that we have the best analytical engine in this field in the world. You can quote me on that. So, but in my when I was representing it, I'm very cautious, very factual, and then you look at a competitor that is maybe not doing anything remotely as advanced as you are, and their tagline is like world leading pay equity software. Like, how can they say that? That's not true. But that doesn't matter, right? So it's all about perception and how you talk about yourself. So that was maybe another thing I really had to kind of rewire my brain, is to be really bold and talk really boldly about what we're doing, because if not, somebody else will claim that they are the best, and nobody cares about, what exactly the delta is in the algorithm. You can disclaim whatever you want. So that was a big change for me personally.
Very interesting. Well, and what I think what I find so interesting about our discussion is the things that you are talking about, and this audience is going to be a very practitioner audience. We all went through this. I got to say, I mean, it's so what's so important about, what you're doing. I mean, as an academic, you understand practice, I think, and in my opinion, incredibly well, and maybe better than most people in your most academics in the world. So it's a great thing for me to hear. Here's a question I wanted to add. I've heard from a number of attendees to this webinar series that they are interested in how your organization approaches managing analytics projects successfully. Can you comment on how PayAnalytics seeks to assure successful projects? For example, how do you measure success? How do you manage scope creep and effectively communicate with and engage? This is to some extent my last question. To effectively communicate and engage your clients.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we are an analytical startup, and we decided really early on that we were not going to be in the consulting business. So, and that was really, we are really mindful, and almost like, a little bit too much maybe sometimes, because consulting doesn't scale, and I don't scale. Like, my time is very limited. So we are not in the consulting business. So then when we think about analytical projects, I mean, we do for special clients, and then we're talking about, international, multinational firms with tens of thousands of employees. We do a little bit of, we call them equal pay projects. This is then applying our analytics at an international scale across countries, across industries, etc. So how do we manage them? Do we manage them well? So for me, interestingly, so I'm trying to choose my words wisely. In the phase that our startup is in right now, we don't mind a scope creep a little bit. So why is that? When we do these projects with clients, we are really focused on learning. So that's our opportunity to have really candid conversations with the clients, learning what are the trouble spots, learning what works and doesn't work in the platform, learning about the operational realities in different countries. So really, we are benefiting a lot. So if there is a little bit of a scope creep, because now we want to add another 3 countries, we are not in the business of, counting pennies, because we are really, all of that learning goes directly into improving the product. So, so I think and I think we don't mind it because of 2 things. One is the learning, and where we are and the second is where we are in the process. So if we were a lot bigger and, we were just in the phase of kind of sell, scale, then maybe we would be more actively managing our analytical projects. Not to say we don't, things are not crazy, but so far we have never counted hours in these pay equity projects because of that reason. And again, kind of thinking to the stage of our startup and where we are at, when we think about how do we scale, is by reputation a lot. So one thing I've learned, so you always learn something when you take on these projects. HR people move around, and if they have technology that they like, they will move that technology with them. So it's almost like a selling strategy. So if they are happy with your platform, and then they get hired somewhere else, they will take the platform with them. So that's another reason why, customer happiness is, really high on our, of what we do, and we try to be really helpful. Because reputation is everything in this business, because HR people, they talk amongst themselves. And interestingly, like when we started in our sandbox, so I'm Icelandic, so, this company started in Iceland. And we never did any advertising in Iceland, ever. So I think we attended and paid for a conference once. And right now we are serving about 30% of the Icelandic workforce. So 30% of salaries in Iceland go through our platform. So without any, and that was just the word of mouth. So it just tells you, kind of gives you, obviously this is a very small community and it's easy to be a big fish in a tiny pond, but that's how kind of the network effect that you can get. So that's a very long answer, but try to justify why we don't manage our analytical projects very well. But where we do manage is our development process. So that's where we spend a lot of time of scoping and making sure that the development runs on time and in scope and all of that, but not the analytics toward the client. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, but so as we're getting about a quarter of the hour now. So what I'm going to do, I still have a couple more questions, which I may ask during this process, but I'm going to go to the Q&A section, and Patricia Neary, a good friend of mine as well, ask this: when I think about my own company, costs are a consideration. Could you tell us about costs? Software itself, software engineer, cloud platform, employees, etc.
So yeah, I think we are cheap. We are cheaper than getting an external consultant to do your pay equity analysis once a year. And I don't have the pricing in my head because I'm the data nerd. I'm the analytical nerd in this organization. So, but I can get you the numbers. But the way we price it, and our pricing strategy has always been, so it scales with the number of employees, not linearly, but kind of concave pricing that scales with the number of employees. And then our strategy has always been on encouraging the usage of the system. So we have never set any limits on the number of users or the number of analysis or anything. So once you subscribe to our platform, it's use it as much as you can. So that's our pricing structure and strategy.
Okay. So I'm going to go to the next question here. I think Patricia clarified that she wanted the strategy, but I think you did focus on that. Manoj Shari asked this question: in your implementation so far, have you faced situations in which fixing pay equity in one dimension, say gender, and another, say race, were in conflict? If so, what were practical ways that you tried to resolve this?
Yeah, so I mean, in conflict and not in conflict. So the way we approach this is that we run basically a multi-objective optimization. That's what's happening in the background. So there are two ways that we can take to this. So it has to do with whether we measure multi-demographic gaps as intersectional or not. If we do take the approach that they're intersectional, meaning let's say that we have men and women, and then we have a majority and minority race. So then what you can do, if you think about everything as intersectionality, then you have majority men, majority women, minority men, minority women. So then what you have literally done is to make all of these gaps independent, and then you close each of them to the highest paid, which is typically, not always, majority men. So so that's one way that you can resolve that. So you look at the subpopulations. When you scale the number of demographics that you're using, sometimes these groups become very small. So if we have gender, age, race, ethnicity, veteran status, for example, that becomes impractical. So then what you can do is, okay, let's not consider intersectionality, but we will close them all simultaneously. So yeah, so then we have to be a little bit careful and play a few tricks, but really we are it's a literally multi-objective optimization. So yes, you will, there are races that will decrease one gap but increase others, but then things balance out. So sometimes things are in conflict, but we just with careful, there's just a lot of careful coding that goes into making sure that we move all of them in the right direction at a steady pace until we close them off.
So just to follow up on that, so it sounds like you do sometimes have to do some model adjustments for a specific case. If for example, if any of those conflicts came up, you may have to sit down and think about the model. Is that the case?
So it really, let me rephrase your question. So I think your question is really about how much of this can you put on the user of the tag, and how much do you have to kind of solve with business intelligence behind the scene, right? So if you have an organization and we see that they want intersectionality, but their groups are getting really small, what do you do? So it's something that is work in progress. So right now we ask the user to make the judgment call. And then if we find that we don't have the group size, we don't make recommendations, but recommend a manual review. So if we only have 3 people in a certain group, we don't have the robustness to measure their pay inequity. But I think that's again a kind of an ongoing challenge, just like the translation of the results into something meaningful and transparent and accurate and easy to read. This is an ongoing challenge, like how you find the balance between the flexibility of the tag and the usability, right? So if you just tell me, here are my demographic variables and now run things, then we have to, on the fly, based on the characteristics of the data, to determine, okay, do we do intersectionality or do we look at them independently, but within a single model? And it's definitely a direction that we want to go in. But I think there's so many things that are in the pipeline before that. We haven't gotten there yet, just to be honest about it. So now that requirement is on the user.
Okay, great. So here's a question that, as we're getting close to the end of the hour, a question that I wanted to ask. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, and feel free to add one if we may be able to squeeze in one more. But this question is, so it's clear that PayAnalytics is a company that has both strong analytics focus, but also a focus on societal equity. So do you see this as a trend And do you believe that such companies can grow, expand, and become a critical market focus? And we've got certainly a lot of societal issues going on in our world today. So how do you see this as maybe a future for OR type work? Is this a market trend?
Yeah, I think it's going to be critical. In my biased opinion, again. I mean, I have always, so, I mean, there was a lot of big words in your question. I mean, I think it's going to be hugely important. So I think when we think about the challenges of today, you know, climate change comes to mind immediately. You know, thinking about the circular economy, thinking about you know,
misuses of so algorithms, for example, which I know is something you have done a lot of work on.
Yeah, you know, ethical use of AI. I mean, I think one big challenge is misinformation. So how do we fight information? How do we, you know, figure out what is truth and not true, and what's a fact and what's not a fact, and are the different dimensions of facts? I mean, I think, yeah, increasingly, and there's huge opportunities. So, so for example, we finished early Series A last November, and we are backed by a fund that only focuses on kind of companies with social focus or environmental focus. So, you know, increasingly, you know, if you think about the investment world, investing in green bonds versus normal bonds, you know, I'm working on a project right now, PayEquity, and we got data from an organization that is focused on gendered investing. So I think increasingly this is going to be very important and a lot of interesting opportunities. So, you know, I've done a lot of things in healthcare, and I think we still haven't figured out fully how we're going to use AI in healthcare, right? And then not only, you know, ethical use of AI in healthcare, but can we think about how we can use AI to discover biases in healthcare and point them out and lead us on the right path? So I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities, yeah, in that broader field.
Is there a way, and just as my last question is to follow up on what you just said, is how do you see attracting new OR graduates or into these areas? I mean, I think I picked up in my years at Maryland what I thought was a turn toward interest in things like this, you know, sustainability and, you know, other areas that were important to young people, and quite frankly, my generation probably messed up. So how do you see bringing that generation into you know, focusing on things like what PayAnalytics focuses on?
I mean, isn't it all about marketing? That's the one thing I've learned from this startup adventure, is that it's all about marketing. You know, but I also think that, you know, the younger generation that is coming in has different thoughts and ideas, and, you know, maybe it's about, for us, we should listen to what are their concerns and think about how we can apply the OR toolkit to those concerns, right? Because that's the source of new ideas instead of recycling old ones.
Okay, well, this has been fascinating for me, and I hope interesting to those on the call, in our audience. Thank you for adding this really important dimension to the discussion of building analytics organizations. I think it's really an important contribution. And to our audience for joining, and please share with your friends this incredible webinar so they can see it online after the fact. So I think we'll sign off here. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.